A forgotten Egyptian text describes a catastrophe of impossible scale. This is not just another myth about gods and monsters. It reads like an eyewitness account of a nuclear explosion, recorded thousands of years before the atomic age. By the end of this journey, you will see one of history's most enduring legends in a completely new and unsettling light. We will investigate a story of a fiery goddess sent to annihilate mankind, a land flooded with a mysterious red liquid, and a civilization that may have possessed a terrible power later lost to time. Could this ancient narrative be a distorted memory of a real, technological disaster that reshaped the world? What does it truly mean to be an advanced civilization? To understand the sheer strangeness of this text, we first need to appreciate the civilization that produced it. Ancient Egypt stands as one of history's most magnificent and enduring cultures, a society whose achievements were both monumental and meticulously planned. For thousands of years, they flourished along the life-giving Nile, their world ordered by predictable floods and the unwavering cycle of the sun. Their genius is etched into the very landscape. The Great Pyramid of Giza, built with millions of perfectly cut stone blocks, each weighing several tons, was the tallest structure in the world for nearly 4,000 years. Its precise alignment to the cardinal points reveals an advanced understanding of astronomy and geometry, a knowledge so deep it feels almost otherworldly even to modern engineers. This was not a culture of random superstition. They were master organizers, brilliant surveyors, and unparalleled architects. Their medicine involved detailed anatomical knowledge and sophisticated surgical practices. They developed one of the world's first writing systems, allowing them to record everything from tax rolls to epic poetry. They tracked the stars to create a calendar so accurate it formed the basis for our own. Their entire civilization was built on a foundation of observable, repeatable, and practical knowledge. They worked with stone and copper, with levers and ramps, with the predictable forces of nature. This established, well-documented brilliance makes the anomalous description of a nuclear-style event so profoundly unsettling. If this account is merely a myth, why does its language so violently clash with everything else we know about their logical, cause and effect world? What could have possibly inspired a people of engineers and astronomers to envision a catastrophe that, by all conventional understanding, should have been completely beyond their imagination? This is the story of the destruction of mankind, a narrative preserved on the walls of royal tombs, including the famed burial chamber of Tutankhamun himself. It is not a simple fable. The text, part of what scholars call the Book of the Heavenly Cow, begins with a chilling premise. The high god Ra, the sun god himself, grows weary of humanity's rebellious schemes. In his divine anger, he decides to wipe the slate clean, but he does not summon a flood or an earthquake. He calls upon his own daughter, the powerful Eye of the Sun, the goddess Hathor. He commands her to descend to Earth and eradicate the human race. Yet as she embarks on her mission, her form shifts, transforming into the terrifying lioness goddess, Sekhmet. Her name alone evokes pure force, Sekhmet, the powerful one. She becomes a storm of divine fury, a being of fire and rage. And here is where the straightforward myth takes a sharp turn into the deeply strange. The text describes her wading into the desert, slaughtering people by the thousands, but the method of this destruction is described with unsettling specificity. It speaks of a land flooded not with water, but with a mysterious red liquid. It tells of a searing, incinerating power that feels less like divine magic and more like a force of nature weaponized. For generations, Egyptologists have interpreted this as a classic allegory, a story about the scorching heat of the sun and the dangers of a pharaoh's wrath. But when you read the words with a modern eye, the imagery feels jarringly familiar. A goddess sent as a weapon of mass destruction, a land stained red. A fire that consumes everything in its path. This is not the language of a simple weather metaphor. It reads like the aftermath of something far more concrete and far more terrible. Why would a civilization of engineers and astronomers choose such violent, specific, and technologically resonant imagery to explain a simple drought or a sandstorm? The answer may lie not in what the story says on its surface, but in what it might be desperately trying to remember. So we are left with a choice, a fundamental fork in the road of interpretation. We can accept the traditional view that this is pure allegory, a story crafted by a sun-worshipping culture to explain the harsh realities of their environment. Or we can consider a far more radical possibility. What if the destruction of mankind is not a myth at all, but a memory, a deeply distorted, culturally refracted memory of a real, cataclysmic event that shattered their world? This is the core hypothesis, a concept anthropologists sometimes call a technological memory. Imagine a society that experiences a disaster so immense, so utterly outside their framework of understanding, that they have no words for what they have witnessed. They possess no concepts of radiation, of shockwaves, or of atomic fire. Their entire vocabulary is built around gods, nature, and magic. How would they describe the blinding flash on the horizon, the heat that vaporizes stone, the strange sickness that follows days later, and the red dust that settles over the land? They would use the only tools they have. The blinding flash becomes the eye of the sun god. The all-consuming heat is the fury of a lioness goddess. The lingering, invisible sickness that kills people weeks after the event, that becomes a curse or a pestilence sent by the gods. The red residue, perhaps from a peculiar type of dust or a mineral vaporized in the blast, becomes a flood of red liquid. Every single element of the Sekhmet story maps with eerie precision onto the known effects of a nuclear detonation and its aftermath. This is not to say the ancient Egyptians had nuclear reactors. The theory suggests they may have been the unfortunate witnesses to a natural, albeit immensely rare, geological or even cosmic event that mimicked the effects of one. Or, in the most speculative versions, it points to a forgotten chapter in human history, a prior civilization that attained a technological peak and then utterly destroyed itself, leaving only vague, terrifying stories behind. The question then shifts. It is no longer, is this a myth? The question becomes, what kind of real-world event could have been so horrifying that the only way to process it was to encode it in a divine narrative, and to carve that warning into the walls of a king's tomb for all eternity? The words carved beside Tutankhamun's sarcophagus are stark and unnerving. They speak of Sekhmet wading in blood, of a land drenched in a red liquid up to the height of a man's ankles. From a traditional standpoint, this is powerful religious poetry. The red liquid is not literal blood, but a potent symbol of the life-giving and life-taking power of the Nile. In the Egyptian mindset, the inundation could bring fertility, but an excessive or strange flood could bring ruin. The scorching power of the sun, embodied by the eye of Ra, could nurture crops or wither them into dust. So the story becomes a cautionary tale about maintaining cosmic order, or Ma'at, against the chaos of rebellion. It is a metaphor for a pharaoh's necessary, if brutal, power to suppress dissent and restore balance. The goddess rampage is the unchecked force of nature itself, a force that must be appeased and controlled. This interpretation is elegant, internally consistent, and fits perfectly within the known framework of Egyptian theology. It makes complete sense, yet when you read the text without that symbolic filter, the imagery takes on a chillingly different character. The description is not of a slow, parching drought. It is of a sudden, overwhelming, and totalizing event. The text emphasizes a pervasive, staining redness, a substance that covers the land. It speaks of a fire that consumes, a force that incinerates. This is not the language of a seasonal change or a bad harvest. It is the language of instantaneous, widespread devastation. Could the red liquid be something else entirely? A literal description of a strange, reddish residue settling after an immense conflagration. In a modern context, we might think of the reddish-brown dust that can follow a massive explosion, or even the peculiar coloration of certain types of sand fused into glass by extreme heat. The focus shifts from a symbolic flood to a literal fallout. The key lies in the specific sequence of events described. The goddess is sent, she transforms into a more destructive form, she unleashes a fire that slaughters, and then the land is flooded with red. This is not a single metaphor, but a step-by-step account of cause and effect. A blinding light descends, A shockwave of heat follows, and then a strange, colored dust settles over everything. The traditional interpretation asks us to see a complex allegory for royal power. The literal reading suggests we might be looking at a primitive, but startlingly accurate, description of a cataclysm. One view sees a lesson carved in stone, the other sees a warning. Sekhmet's rampage is described with a terrifying step-by-step progression. She does not merely appear and destroy. First, she is dispatched, a weapon sent from above. Then she transforms, her nature shifting into something far more destructive. Finally, she unleashes her fury, and the text specifies she uses fire and her scorching breath to consume the land. This is not a vague supernatural event. It is a sequence of distinct, violent phenomena. The fire that precedes her, the breath that scorches the earth. This reads less like a metaphor for anger and more like an eyewitness trying to catalog the unimaginable. The initial flash of light, the searing heat that follows, and the incendiary effect that sets the world ablaze. In a modern context, this is the precise order of a nuclear detonation's immediate effects. The thermal pulse arrives first, a wave of heat so intense it can ignite fires over a vast area almost instantaneously. This is Sekhmet's fire. Then comes the blast wave, a wall of superheated, compressed air moving at supersonic speeds, scouring the landscape and demolishing everything in its path. This could easily be described as a scorching, destructive breath. The text even notes that her breath was like a furnace, a detail that feels unnervingly literal. Why would a civilization that understood the gentle warmth of the sun need to invent a goddess whose very breath was like a forge? Unless they had witnessed or inherited a story about a heat so intense it could melt stone and sand into glass. The description of her wading through the desert, slaughtering thousands, aligns perfectly with the effects of a blast wave radiating outward from a central point, an expanding circle of absolute annihilation where nothing is left standing. This is not the selective punishment of a deity. This is the indiscriminate, geometric spread of a physical force. The story captures the sheer scale and impersonal nature of the destruction. It was not a battle, it was an eradication, but the story does not end with the slaughter. It takes an even stranger turn, one that seems to defy all rational explanation. The gods themselves grow horrified by the scale of the destruction. Sekhmet's rage is uncontrollable, and she threatens to annihilate all of humanity, upsetting the cosmic balance. So Ra devises a clever, bizarre plan to stop her. He orders his priests to flood the fields with a vast quantity of beer, dyed a deep, bloody red with crushed ochre and pomegranate juice. This red beer is poured across the land, creating the illusion of a great sea of blood. The next morning, Sekhmet sees this red liquid, and, believing her work is complete, stops to drink. She becomes so intoxicated by the beer that she falls into a deep sleep, forgetting her murderous rampage, and humanity is saved. On the surface, this is a fantastical folktale, a divine trick to appease a drunken goddess. Yet, when viewed through the lens of our nuclear hypothesis, this epilogue transforms from a quaint myth into a potential allegory for decontamination. Think about it. After a radiological event, one of the primary challenges is dealing with fallout, the radioactive dust that settles over everything. How do you neutralize it, or at least wash it away? You use a liquid. You flood the area. In this story, the land is deliberately covered in a liquid to pacify a destructive force that has left a red residue. The red beer could be a symbolic representation of a desperate, large-scale attempt to wash the land clean of a poisonous, red-stained substance. The intoxicating effect on Sekhmet is particularly telling. She does not die. She is pacified and falls asleep. If Sekhmet represents the lingering, invisible sickness of radiation, then rendering her dormant is exactly what you would hope to achieve through decontamination. You cannot kill radiation, but you can mitigate its effects. You can render it less active, less harmful. The story perfectly captures this concept. The destructive power is not vanquished, it is simply put to sleep. This interpretation turns a divine comedy into a profound survival memory. It suggests a primitive understanding that after the Great Fire, the land itself was poisoned, and the only hope was to somehow wash that poison away. The red beer ploy is no longer just a clever bit of mythology. It becomes a cryptic record of a post-catastrophe response, a folk memory of a civilization trying to cleanse a world stained by something they could not possibly comprehend. The devastation Sekhmet leaves in her wake is absolute. The ancient text describes a land laid utterly barren, a world scoured clean of life. This is not merely a temporary setback for humanity. It is a fundamental wound inflicted upon the earth itself. The descriptions speak of a scorched and silent landscape, where nothing grows and no creatures stir. This imagery of a permanent, sterile desert aligns with a terrifying modern concept, the idea of a nuclear winter or the long-term ecological collapse that follows radiological contamination. A single, catastrophic event does not just kill the people present at that moment. It poisons the soil, it taints the water, and it destroys the very food chain for generations. The land becomes incapable of supporting life. This is precisely what the myth conveys, a world returned to a primordial state of emptiness, a direct reversal of creation. The Egyptian worldview was built on cycles of death and rebirth, but this event seems to break that cycle entirely. It presents a finality that their culture was otherwise designed to deny. Consider the aftermath of a massive firestorm, one so intense it consumes all available fuel and leaves behind only ash, or the lingering poison of radiation, which can render fertile ground sterile and cause birth defects in animals and humans for decades. The myth Scorched Earth is a perfect, if primitive, description of this. The text does not say the land will recover after a few seasons. It implies a lasting desolation, a permanent change to the environment. This level of detail goes far beyond a simple story about a drought. A drought ends, the rains eventually return. But what is described here is an annihilation so complete that the gods themselves have to intervene to restart creation, to somehow cleanse the world and make it habitable again. Why would a civilization that lived and died by the predictable, life-giving floods of the Nile imagine a destruction so total that it shatters the natural order? The most logical answer is that they were not imagining it. They were remembering an ecological trauma so profound it became etched into their collective memory, a warning about a power that could unmake the world itself. The story carved in stone is compelling, but words alone cannot prove a cataclysm. For that, we must turn to the earth itself, searching for physical scars that match the myth's terrifying description. This search leads us directly to one of the most contentious pieces of the puzzle, a phenomenon that seems to defy all conventional explanations for ancient Egypt. Scattered in remote areas of the desert, there are reports of strange, glazed stones. This is not the natural glass formed by lightning strikes, which creates small, tubular fulgurites. This is something far more vast. We are talking about patches of desert sand and stone that have been fused into a solid, glassy sheet, a process called vitrification. To transform sand into glass requires immense, concentrated heat, temperatures soaring to over 1,800 degrees Celsius. In the ancient world, the only way to achieve such heat was through a sustained, man-made furnace, like a kiln or a forge. But these vitrified patches are not the sites of ancient workshops. They are out in the open desert, far from any known industrial activity. So what could have possibly generated a heat so intense it literally melted the ground? The temperatures required are comparable to those found at the heart of a modern nuclear explosion. When the first atomic bomb was tested in the deserts of New Mexico, the sand at the blast site was fused into a new, greenish glass they called trinitite. The presence of similar glass in the Egyptian desert raises a profound and unsettling question. Could this be the literal, physical fallout from Sekhmet's fiery breath? Is this the scorched earth the myth describes, preserved not in papyrus, but in stone itself? Of course, mainstream archaeology offers alternative explanations. Some scientists propose these glass fields could be the result of a massive atmospheric airburst, perhaps from a comet or meteorite that exploded high above the desert, raining down a wave of thermal energy so powerful it flash melted the surface below. This is a credible natural phenomenon, one that could indeed produce the required heat. Yet, the controversy persists because the pattern of this vitrification does not always perfectly match the scattered debris field of an airburst. The distribution can seem strangely concentrated, as if the source of the heat was not a fireball in the sky, but something emanating from, or striking, the ground directly. This is where the nuclear hypothesis finds its most tangible and most debated evidence. If the vitrification was caused by a natural event, it is a staggering coincidence that it exists in the same lands that gave us a myth about a goddess of incineration. But if it was not natural, then what are we truly looking at? A geological anomaly, or the ghost of a forgotten technology? The glass itself holds no answers, only a silent, shimmering testament to an ancient heat that should not have been possible. The debate over the desert glass is only the beginning. Beneath the shimmering surface lies a deeper, more disturbing layer of evidence. Scientists analyzing soil samples from certain archaeological sites in Egypt have occasionally detected unusual spikes in radiation. These are not the normal background levels you would expect from naturally occurring elements like granite or radon. These readings are localized anomalies, concentrated in specific, confined areas, as if something had contaminated the ground in that exact spot long ago. Of course, the immediate, conventional explanation points to modern sources. Perhaps a piece of medical equipment was once stored there, or a container with radioactive materials was broken open. Yet, in some instances, these explanations feel insufficient, like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. The context is wrong. Why would such contamination appear in the middle of an ancient ruin, far from any 20th century facility? The pattern defies easy logic. If these radiation spikes were indeed modern, we would expect them to correlate with known industrial or medical sites, not with the sacred geography of a pharaoh's temple or a forgotten desert outpost. The very randomness of these hotspots makes them strangely compelling. They are ghost signals from the past, faint echoes of an energy that should not have been present. Could this be the lingering signature of Sekhmet's invisible pestilence, the curse that followed her fiery breath? Radiation sickness, after all, is an insidious killer. It strikes days or weeks after exposure, its cause completely invisible to the naked eye. To an ancient people, this would have been the most terrifying magic imaginable. A person could seem perfectly healthy after the Great Fire, only to sicken and die mysteriously later. What else could they possibly attribute this to, other than a divine curse, a lingering wrath that clung to the very stones? The myth describes a land that remained poisoned long after the initial destruction, and these anomalous readings in the soil offer a tantalizing, if controversial, physical parallel. They suggest that the destruction was not merely thermal, but radiological. The Earth itself remembers a poison it cannot shed. Beyond radiation, the mineralogical evidence grows even stranger. In certain locations, researchers have found deposits of fused minerals and strangely colored stone that seem to have been subjected to instantaneous, extreme heat. One of the most telling pieces of this puzzle is a substance known as trinitite, the green, glassy residue created on the desert floor by the first atomic bomb test in 1945. Its chemical composition is unique, a fingerprint of man-made atomic fire. Now, consider the reports of similar, ancient vitrified material found in Egypt, not in vast sheets, but in smaller, concentrated patches. When analyzed, some of these samples show mineral profiles and fusion patterns that are incredibly difficult to explain through any known natural process, like a lightning strike or a simple wildfire. The temperatures required are simply too high, and the duration of the heat too short. A wildfire burns, it chars and blackens. It does not flash melt quartz and feldspar into a homogeneous glass in a matter of seconds. That requires a shock of energy, a sudden, explosive release of power. The scientific community is deeply divided on what could cause this. The leading theory remains a cosmic airburst, a comet or asteroid exploding in the atmosphere and bathing the ground in a momentary inferno. This is a valid and documented phenomenon, but the debate rages because the evidence on the ground does not always neatly conform to the model of an airburst. The vitrification is sometimes too localized, or the pattern of debris does not match the expected scatter from a sky-borne explosion. It is as if the epicenter of the heat was not in the air, but on the ground itself. This is the heart of the controversy. Are we looking at the scars of a natural, albeit catastrophic, event from space? Or does the peculiar distribution of this ancient glass point to something else, something with a terrestrial origin that science has yet to fully categorize? The glass and the anomalous minerals stand as silent, stubborn witnesses. They refuse to fit perfectly into any conventional box, forcing us to confront a disquieting possibility. The myth of Sekhmet may be more than a story. It could be the key that helps us read the geological record, a narrative that gives a name and a face to the terrifying, physical forces that once reshaped this ancient land. The mystery of a forgotten nuclear event does not belong to Egypt alone. Far to the east, in the sprawling ruins of Mohenjo-Daro, another ancient civilization presents a puzzle that echoes the story of Sekhmet with haunting clarity. This great city of the Indus Valley was one of the most sophisticated of its time, a marvel of urban planning with its grid-like streets and advanced drainage systems. Yet, around 4,000 years ago, it was suddenly, inexplicably abandoned. The cause of its downfall has been a subject of fierce debate for decades. While many archaeologists point to climate change or invasion, a more radical theory suggests the city was struck by a cataclysm of unimaginable force. At the heart of this theory are the strange and unsettling conditions in which the city was found. The streets were littered with skeletons, many contorted in positions of sudden, agonizing death, as if they had been caught in a single, overwhelming instant. Some of these bodies were found in groups, as if people were huddled together when the end came. This alone is unusual, as most ancient cities show evidence of war or gradual decline, not a population frozen in a moment of terror. But the anomalies only grow stranger from there. In certain areas of the ruin, archaeologists reported that the bricks of the buildings appeared to have been vitrified, fused and melted as if by a brief, intense heat. Even more controversially, some early investigations claim to have found higher than normal levels of radiation in some of the skeletal remains. If true, this would suggest these people were exposed to something far more sinister than a conventional fire or a battle. The parallels to the Egyptian narrative are staggering. Here, we have another advanced, organized civilization seemingly brought to an abrupt end by a force that involved immense heat and a lingering, invisible sickness. The skeletons of Mohenjo-Daro could be the physical counterpart to the myth of Sekhmet's slaughter, a silent testimony to a real event that killed thousands in a flash. The vitrified stone echoes the desert glass of Egypt, a potential fingerprint of the same impossible temperature, and the whispers of radiation offer a scientific parallel to the curse that followed the lioness goddess, an unseen poison that clung to the victims long after the initial event. This connection forces us to widen our perspective. Could these two distant cultures, separated by vast deserts and mountain ranges, have been recording different facets of the same global catastrophe? Or were they both witnesses to separate, but technologically similar, disasters? The idea that two of the world's first great civilizations might have collapsed under the shadow of a force we would recognize as nuclear is a proposition that challenges the very foundations of history. It suggests that the story of our past is not a simple, linear progression from primitive to advanced, but a cycle with forgotten peaks and terrifying collapses. The ruins of Mohenjo-Daro do not offer easy answers, only more profound questions, written in melted stone and unburied bones. The echoes of a world-scorching fire are not confined to the banks of the Nile. Across the globe and across cultures, our oldest stories whisper of the same terrifying theme, a cataclysm of flame from the heavens that purges humanity. The biblical account of Sodom and Gomorrah is a powerful parallel. Two cities, consumed by a rain of fire and brimstone sent by a wrathful God. The description is stark, a divine judgment that obliterates the urban landscape in a conflagration so complete that Lot's wife is warned not to even look back, lest she be overcome. This is not a simple wildfire. It is a targeted, overwhelming incineration. Similar narratives of world-ending fire appear in the lore of the Aztecs, who believed the current age would be destroyed by colossal earthquakes and a sun of fire. Norse mythology foretells Ragnarok, a final battle that ends with the world engulfed in flames, only to be reborn from the ashes. Even beyond fire, the ubiquitous flood myths from the Epic of Gilgamesh to the stories of Deucalion in Greek lore, share a common structure, a civilization being reset by an unimaginable force of nature. The question these parallels force upon us is profound. Are these merely universal human fears, projected onto the cosmos as cautionary tales? Or could they be the fractured, culturally refracted memories of a real, global catastrophe? It seems unlikely that dozens of disparate cultures, with no contact with one another, would independently invent such specific and similar stories of absolute annihilation by fire and water. The common root may not be in our psychology, but in our shared ancient history. Perhaps these are not metaphors at all, but survivor accounts, a generation that lived through a period of immense geological and cosmic turmoil, where the sky truly seemed to fall, and the earth itself burned, encoded their trauma into the most durable medium they had, story. They passed down a warning to their children, and their children's children, a visceral memory of a time when the world almost ended. When we place the story of Sekhmet beside these other legends, it ceases to be an isolated Egyptian curiosity. It becomes a single chapter in a much larger, more terrifying book, a collective human memory of a forgotten age of fire. This possibility forces us to confront the single greatest scientific hurdle. Could an ancient civilization, even a brilliant one like Egypt, have possibly achieved nuclear fission? The sheer scale of knowledge required seems to place it firmly in the realm of science fiction. Modern nuclear physics is built upon centuries of accumulated discovery, from the atomic theory to a deep understanding of subatomic particles like neutrons and protons. The ancient Egyptians had no concept of these things. Their understanding of matter was based on the observable elements of their world: earth, air, fire, and water. To suggest they could leap from that to enriching uranium or building a reactor feels, on its face, completely absurd. The engineering challenges are even more monumental. A nuclear device requires incredibly pure radioactive materials, refined through complex chemical and centrifuge processes that demand a precision manufacturing base they simply did not possess. They worked with copper and bronze, not centrifuges and control rods. The idea of them constructing a functional atomic bomb, with its precise critical mass and initiator, seems beyond any reasonable probability. This is the overwhelming consensus of modern science, and for very good reason. The gap in fundamental knowledge is simply too vast to bridge. So where does that leave our terrifying myth? If they could not have built it, then what was the source of the cataclysm they described? This is where the mystery deepens, shifting from human invention to forces entirely beyond human control. Perhaps the answer is not a lost technology, but a remembered natural disaster of almost biblical proportions. The universe itself possesses the power to create nuclear reactions without any human intervention at all. Deep underground in Oklo, Gabon, scientists discovered a 2-billion-year-old natural nuclear fission reactor, where geological conditions perfectly concentrated uranium and groundwater acted as a moderator, creating a self-sustaining chain reaction that ran for hundreds of thousands of years. This proves that nature can achieve fission all on its own. Could a similar, though far more violent, natural event have occurred in the ancient past? Or perhaps the trigger came from the sky. A massive comet, rich in radioactive isotopes, could have exploded in the atmosphere, releasing energy equivalent to a thermonuclear blast. The heat would flash melt the desert into glass, the shockwave would level cities, and the subsequent fallout of radioactive dust would poison the land and cause the mysterious sickness described in the myths. This cosmic airburst theory provides a terrifyingly plausible natural mechanism for every element of the Sekhmet story, without requiring a single ancient engineer. The story, then, is not a record of a weapon they built, but a trauma they survived. It is the memory of a day when the sun seemed to fall to earth, when the gods themselves appeared to declare war on humanity. The red liquid was the strange, colored fallout. The scorching breath was the thermal pulse. The lingering pestilence was radiation sickness. The myth becomes a perfect, if allegorical, eyewitness account of a natural nuclear event. So we are left with two profound possibilities. Either our ancient ancestors were witnesses to a geological or cosmic catastrophe so rare and powerful it mimicked a technology we would not reinvent for millennia, or the entire foundation of human history is wrong, and a cycle of advanced civilization and catastrophic collapse lies buried in our distant past. Both answers are equally unsettling, forcing us to reconsider the fragility of our own world and the true meaning of the warnings left to us in stone. Perhaps the answer lies not in a forgotten bomb, but in a forgotten power source. If the ancient world did not build a reactor, could they have somehow harnessed a natural one? We know this is possible. In Aklo, Gabon, nature itself created a sustained nuclear fission reaction nearly 2 billion years ago, where underground water percolated through rich uranium deposits, acting as a perfect moderator for a chain reaction. What if the ancient Egyptians stumbled upon a similar, though far more unstable, geological anomaly, a naturally occurring atomic pile that one day went critical, not in a slow burn over millennia, but in a violent, explosive release of energy? This would not require any advanced knowledge on their part. They would simply be living near a geological ticking clock, a power source they revered or feared without understanding its true nature. The resulting catastrophe would be indistinguishable from a nuclear detonation to any witness, providing all the physical evidence of vitrified sand and lingering radiation, but born entirely from the Earth's own hidden architecture. Another compelling theory points to forces locked within the very stones they built with. The Great Pyramid itself is a monumental structure under immense, constant pressure. Certain crystals, like quartz, generate an electrical charge when subjected to mechanical stress, a phenomenon known as the piezoelectric effect. Imagine the sheer weight of millions of tons of limestone, compressing the quartz crystals embedded within the pyramid's core over centuries. Could this have built up a colossal, latent electrical charge? Some researchers speculate that if this energy were suddenly released, perhaps triggered by an earthquake or even a specific harmonic resonance, it could manifest as a tremendous arc of plasma, a man-made lightning bolt of divine proportions. This sudden discharge of energy would produce an instantaneous, blinding flash of light and intense, localized heat capable of fusing stone and sand into glass. The destructive effect would be terrifyingly specific and powerful, a burst of raw power that could easily be interpreted as the wrath of a sun god, leaving behind the very scars we find so puzzling today. Then there are the more exotic possibilities, theories that venture into the realm of truly lost science. Could the ancients have mastered a form of energy manipulation that we are only now rediscovering? Concepts like acoustic levitation, using precise sound waves to manipulate massive objects, are hinted at in their own legends and are being explored in modern physics labs. What if they understood how to focus and amplify terrestrial energy, channeling the Earth's own magnetic or vibrational fields through massive, precisely aligned stone structures? Think of the pyramids not just as tombs, but as gigantic energy capacitors or transmitters. A civilization that could chart the stars with such precision likely possessed a deep, intuitive understanding of the Earth's hidden energies. A catastrophic failure of such a system, a feedback loop or a resonant overload, could have unleashed a concentrated beam of thermal or acoustic energy with devastating, nuclear-like effects. This would explain the localized vitrification and the strange, selective destruction that an airburst cannot always account for. The red liquid described in the myth could then be a symbolic representation of a different kind of fallout, perhaps a slurry of mineralized, oxidized dust from the vaporized stone of the structure itself. Each of these theories offers a different path to the same terrifying destination, a world-scorching event that required no atomic bomb. They suggest that the line between advanced technology and a deep, sacred understanding of natural forces might have been far blurrier in the ancient world than we ever supposed. The real mystery may not be whether they possessed our technology, but whether they possessed a different kind of science altogether, one whose catastrophic failure left behind only myths and melted stone as a warning for the ages. Another artifact whispers of a forgotten science, the Baghdad battery. Discovered in the 1930s, this simple clay jar contained a copper cylinder and an iron rod, sealed with an asphalt stopper. If filled with an acidic liquid like vinegar or wine, It would have generated a small electrical charge, around 1 or 2 volts. To some, this is clear proof of ancient electroplating, a technology that should not have existed for another 2,000 years. The idea is tantalizing. A civilization that could generate electricity might have possessed the foundational knowledge for far greater and more dangerous applications of power. Could this humble jar be a fragment of a much larger, lost technological framework? If they understood basic galvanic principles, what else might they have understood about the nature of matter and energy? This line of thinking seems to offer a potential bridge, a way to explain how a nuclear-level event could have been possible in the deep past. It suggests a world where the light of knowledge flickered brightly, only to be extinguished and forgotten. Yet, the story of the battery is far from conclusive. Mainstream archaeology offers a much simpler explanation. The jar was found alongside other artifacts that suggest a more mundane, though still clever, purpose. It could have been used for electrotherapy, a primitive form of pain relief using the mild tingling sensation of the current. Or perhaps it was a sacred object, a device to create a small but mysterious divine spark within a temple, a piece of religious theater to awe the faithful. The single most important fact, however, is that no wires, no connectors, and no electroplated objects have ever been found with these jars. Without a complete circuit, the battery remains an isolated curiosity, a solution in search of a problem. This is why it is often called a technological red herring. It points toward a tantalizing possibility, but it ultimately lacks the corroborating evidence to prove its use in any advanced application. It demonstrates ingenuity, not industry. The ancient world was full of such brilliant, isolated discoveries, from the steam-powered eolipile in Hellenistic Greece to the intricate Antikythera mechanism. These were marvels of their time, but they were not the seeds of an industrial revolution. They remained fascinating dead ends. So, while the battery proves that the ancients were observant and clever, it does not prove they were on the verge of unlocking atomic power. The gap between a 2-volt cell in a clay pot and the enrichment of uranium is an ocean of knowledge wider than the Sahara itself. This artifact, then, serves as a crucial lesson in our search for answers. It is a warning against connecting dots that are too far apart. The real mystery of the ancient world may not lie in a handful of anomalous objects, but in the profound and unsettling accuracy of their stories that seem to describe forces which they could not have created, but perhaps only survived. This is precisely where the mainstream Egyptological perspective offers a powerful and compelling counterargument. For the vast majority of scholars, the story of Sekhmet is not a garbled historical record. It is a profound and sophisticated work of theological literature, a symbolic narrative designed to explain the very foundations of their society. The key to understanding it lies in the concept of Mot. Mot was not just a word for the ancient Egyptians. It was the principle of cosmic order, truth, and justice that held the universe together. It was the reason the sun rose each morning and the Nile flooded each year. Chaos and disorder, known as Isfet, were the eternal enemies of this delicate balance. In this context, the rebellion against Ra is not a literal human uprising. It represents the ever-present threat of Isfet, the chaos that constantly seeks to overwhelm the established order. Ra's response, sending his daughter as a weapon, is a necessary, if brutal, act of cosmic maintenance. He is not a genocidal tyrant. He is a sovereign restoring balance to a universe slipping into anarchy. The transformation into Sekhmet, the powerful one, embodies the untamed, destructive force required to crush chaos utterly. It is the raw, unchecked power of the sun that can scorch the earth, a force that must be wielded with precision. The subsequent flooding of the land with red beer is the crucial second act. This is where the myth transitions from pure destruction to controlled restoration. The gods intervene not out of pity for humanity, but because total annihilation would itself be a form of chaos. The universe needs humanity, but humanity must know its place. The red beer, a clever substitution for blood, symbolizes a ritualized, non-lethal conclusion. It pacifies the destructive force without eliminating it entirely, allowing order to be re-established. Sekhmet, the embodiment of divine fury, is not killed. She is integrated. She becomes a protector goddess, a guardian of pharaohs, her power now channeled to defend Mot rather than to destroy it. This entire narrative serves as a divine justification for the pharaoh's absolute power. The pharaoh was the living embodiment of Horus, the son of Ra, on earth. His role was to enact Mot, to use force when necessary to suppress rebellion and maintain harmony, just as the gods did in the celestial realm. The story is a lesson carved in stone, a permanent reminder that the king's authority to wage war and execute judgment is a sacred duty, a reflection of a divine blueprint. From this established academic viewpoint, searching for a historical nuclear event in this text is a fundamental misreading. It is like analyzing Shakespeare's Macbeth for clues about medieval Scottish politics, while missing the entire play's exploration of ambition and guilt. The symbols are not code for real-world events, they are the point itself. The red liquid is a poetic metaphor for the life-giving and life-taking power of the inundation. The fiery breath is the scorching wind from the desert. The story is a timeless allegory about the nature of power, the cost of order, and the delicate pact between gods and humanity. To reduce it to a primitive description of a bomb is to ignore its profound philosophical depth. So we stand at a crossroads of interpretation. One path leads us into the desert, searching for melted glass and radiation. The other leads us into the quiet halls of academia, where the text is understood as a masterwork of symbolic thought. Which path reveals the deeper truth? Science offers its own compelling answers for the desert's strange glass. The intense heat required to fuse sand can be generated by a massive lightning strike. When a powerful bolt hits a sandy plain, it can instantly create a fulgurate, a tube of glass tracing the path of the electrical discharge through the ground. While most fulgurites are small and root-like, a strike of extraordinary power, or a series of strikes in the same area, could theoretically create larger, more sheet-like patches of vitrified material. Consider the raw power contained within a single thunderstorm cloud. The voltage differential is staggering, and when it discharges, it can heat the air around it to temperatures 5 times hotter than the surface of the sun. It is a natural, terrestrial force capable of producing the very effects we find so mysterious. Beyond lightning, look to the sky. The solar system is filled with debris, and Earth's history is punctuated by impacts from asteroids and comets. When a large space rock enters the atmosphere, it can explode before it hits the ground, releasing a tremendous blast of thermal energy in an airburst. This phenomenon is not just theoretical. In 1908, a massive explosion over the Tunguska River in Siberia flattened 80 million trees across 800 square miles. The consensus is that it was an airburst from a comet or asteroid. While no crater was formed, the heat generated was intense enough to scorch the landscape, and if it had occurred over a sandy desert, could have easily created vast fields of glass. This single event provides a perfect natural blueprint for the kind of cataclysm that could inspire a story like Sekhmet's Rampage, without a single ounce of enriched uranium. And then there are the simple, human-scale explanations. The ancient Egyptians were master craftsmen. They operated kilns and furnaces for pottery, faience, and metalworking. A particularly large and hot industrial site, perhaps one dedicated to smelting copper or creating glassware itself, could have left behind localized patches of vitrified ground. If such a site was later abandoned and eroded by the desert winds, all that might remain is the hardened, glassy floor, stripped of any context, looking impossibly ancient and out of place to modern explorers. These scientific explanations are powerful because they are grounded in observable, repeatable phenomena. We see lightning. We have evidence of impacts. We know the capabilities of ancient industry. They form a complete, logical picture that requires no lost civilizations or unknown technologies. The real mystery, then, may not be the existence of the glass, but our own powerful desire to see something miraculous in the ordinary scars left by nature and time. The allure of a forgotten nuclear age taps into something far deeper than a simple historical puzzle. It speaks to a profound and enduring human desire for a past that is more epic, more mysterious, and more terrifying than the one presented in our textbooks. This narrative of a lost, high-tech civilization feeds on our innate suspicion that the official story is incomplete. We gaze at the sheer scale of the pyramids or the precision of millennia-old stonework, and a quiet voice whispers that our linear progression from primitive to advanced might be an illusion. The theory offers a more dramatic alternative, a history punctuated by catastrophic rises and falls, where our own era is just the latest chapter in a cycle of forgetting. It transforms humanity from a species on a steady climb to the inheritors of a cosmic tragedy, living in the shadow of ancestors whose power and folly dwarfed our own. This is the core of forbidden archaeology, a field built on the thrilling premise that mainstream science is ignoring its most inconvenient discoveries. When experts dismiss vitrified desert glass as a natural phenomenon or explain the Baghdad Battery as a religious object, it feels to believers like a deliberate cover-up, an attempt to keep us in the dark about our true potential. The idea gains further traction from the ancient astronaut hypothesis, which posits that our ancestors were either guided by or warred with beings from the stars. In this framework, a nuclear event is no longer just a geological accident or a human mistake. It becomes a weapon in a celestial conflict, a scar from a war of the gods that was recorded not as science fiction, but as sacred myth. The story of Sekhmet, then, is not merely a memory of a disaster. It is a fragment of a much larger cosmic battle, a piece of evidence that we are not alone and that our history is intertwined with forces beyond our comprehension. This fusion of ideas creates a powerful and seductive alternative history. It rewrites humanity's role from masters of the planet to survivors of an apocalypse, children playing in the ruins of a world we no longer understand. There is a strange comfort in this cyclical view. It suggests that collapse is not an end, but a phase, that even if our modern civilization were to vanish, something new would eventually rise from the ashes, just as we supposedly did. It makes our own technological anxieties about nuclear war or environmental collapse feel less like a unique failure, and more like a recurring pattern in the human story. We are not the first to hold such power, the theory implies, and we may not be the last to lose it. This psychological underpinning is why the theory persists despite overwhelming scientific skepticism. It is not really about the evidence of melted stone or anomalous radiation readings. It is about the story, a story that offers mystery where there is mundane explanation, cosmic significance where there is simple human ingenuity, and a warning from a lost world that feels hauntingly relevant to our own. The blinding flash over Hiroshima was described by survivors as a sun, born at the wrong place and at the wrong time. They spoke of a light that bleached the world white, followed by heat so intense it scorched shadows into stone and fused the very patterns of clothing onto human skin. Then came the wind, a monstrous, scorching breath that flattened an entire city in a single, roaring instant. These are not the words of poets or mythmakers. They are the clinical, horrifying observations of ordinary people who witnessed the impossible. And when you place their testimony beside the ancient Egyptian text, the parallels become too stark to ignore. The survivors of the atomic blast described a pillar of smoke and fire rising to the heavens, a description that mirrors the image of the sun god Ra dispatching his fiery eye. The thermal pulse that ignited everything flammable across Hiroshima is Sekhmet's all-consuming fire. The blast wave that tore buildings from their foundations and hurled people through the air is her scorching breath, the furnace wind that annihilated thousands in the desert. But the most chilling similarities emerge in the aftermath, in the details that no ancient person could have possibly invented. After the initial explosion in Japan, a strange, dark rain began to fall. It was not water, but a thick, greasy, black precipitation laden with radioactive soot and debris from the vaporized city. Survivors recall being covered in this grim, sticky substance. In the Egyptian myth, the land is flooded with a red liquid. While the colors differ, the concept is identical: a pervasive, unnatural liquid staining the world after a cataclysmic fire. Both stories describe a landscape poisoned by a residue from the sky. Then there is the lingering death. In the weeks and months following the bombings, thousands of people who had seemingly survived the initial blast began to sicken and die from a mysterious illness. Their hair fell out, They were plagued with fevers and internal bleeding, and they perished without a visible wound. To the doctors of 1945, this was radiation sickness. To the ancient Egyptians, this would have been the invisible pestilence of Sekhmet's curse, a divine wrath that killed long after the goddess had passed. The stories from Japan give a human voice to the silent skeletons of Mohenjo-Daro and provide a scientific key for the allegorical plague in the tomb of Tutankhamun. They complete a terrifying circuit, connecting a modern catastrophe with an ancient text through the universal language of human suffering. This comparison does not prove the Egyptians had the bomb. Instead, it demonstrates with brutal clarity how a real nuclear event is perceived, processed, and remembered by a human civilization. The people of Hiroshima used the only vocabulary they had, describing a new sun and a demonic wind. The people of ancient Egypt, witnessing a similar cataclysm, used the only vocabulary they had, describing a wrathful sun god and a lioness goddess of fire. The technology may change, but the human experience of absolute, world-shattering power remains the same, echoing across the millennia as a warning written in fire and blood. Our oldest stories were not written, they were spoken, passed from one generation to the next around flickering fires. This process of oral tradition is not a perfect recording. It is a living, breathing thing that bends and shapes memory to fit the understanding of the present. A real, traumatic event, seared into the collective mind of a people, would not be preserved like a clinical report. It would be transformed. The terrifying facts would be wrapped in the only available explanations, the language of gods and magic, to make the unimaginable somehow comprehensible to those who came after. Think of a game of telephone played across 1,000 years. The core truth remains, but the details morph to serve the culture's evolving worldview. A massive explosion becomes a god's angry eye. A plume of radioactive dust becomes a flood of red liquid. The lingering sickness becomes a divine curse. The story is not a lie. It is a fossil, its original shape preserved within a hardened shell of symbolism. We see this pattern everywhere. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia have maintained detailed oral histories for over 40,000 years. Stories that accurately describe coastlines and islands that were submerged at the end of the last ice age. The facts of a changed geography are undeniable within the tales, yet they are woven into the dreamtime, the sacred narrative of creation. The real event is not lost, it is encoded. Similarly, the Icelandic saga of Ildja describes a catastrophic volcanic eruption in the 10th century. The text poetically recounts a time when the sun vanished, the sky rained fire, and the world was plunged into a foggy darkness. This is not just myth-making. Ice core samples from Greenland confirm a massive volcanic event in precisely the same period, one that spewed ash across the hemisphere and caused years of global cooling. The saga got the facts right, but framed them within a dramatic, human story of conflict and divine displeasure. The event was real, but its meaning was crafted for the listeners. This is the crucial lens through which we must view the destruction of mankind. If a nuclear-level cataclysm did occur in the deep past, the survivors would have been left with a shattered world and a trauma beyond words. How could they possibly explain it to their children and their children's children? They could not speak of isotopes and shockwaves. They could only say that the sun god had grown angry, that his daughter had become a monster of fire, and that the land itself was poisoned by her wrath. The story becomes a vessel, a durable container for a fragile, horrifying truth. The specific details of the technology are lost, but the visceral human experience of the event, the blinding light, the scorching heat, the strange sickness, the desperate attempt to cleanse the land, these core truths are preserved with stunning accuracy. The myth is not a history book. It is something far more powerful, a collective memory, cauterized by trauma and passed down as a warning for the ages. So what would it actually take to convince the world of an ancient atomic war? Imagine an archaeologist, a century from now, trying to prove a nuclear bomb was dropped on a modern city. After thousands of years of erosion, sediment, and rebuilding, the evidence would be incredibly subtle. The first and most crucial piece of the puzzle would be a specific radioactive fingerprint. We would need to find a layer in the soil, a distinct stratum, containing anomalous isotopes that simply do not occur in nature. The most telling would be a concentration of plutonium-239. This element is almost exclusively man-made, a direct byproduct of nuclear reactors and weapons. Finding it in an ancient geological layer would be a smoking gun of unimaginable power. Other isotopes, like certain forms of cesium-137 or strontium-90, could also serve as evidence, but their signatures fade over centuries. Plutonium's half-life is over 24,000 years, making it a potential messenger from a deep-time catastrophe. But finding such a layer is a needle in a planetary haystack. It would require knowing exactly where to look and drilling down through meters of accumulated history to take a pristine, uncontaminated core sample. The second form of evidence would be a crater, but not just any crater. A nuclear detonation leaves a very specific signature. If it explodes on the surface, it creates a wide, shallow bowl with a distinctive glassy lip, fused from melted soil and rock. The ground zero point would be littered with vitrified material, but its chemical composition would be unique. It would show evidence of elements being vaporized and then rapidly condensed, a process called fractionation, which creates a unique mineralogical profile. This is different from the glass created by a lightning strike or even a meteorite impact. A meteorite brings extraterrestrial material, like iridium, and its impact glass, called tektites, are formed by different pressures and temperatures. The nuclear glass would be a product of pure, instantaneous heat without the telltale signs of an extraterrestrial body. The problem is, after 5,000 or 6,000 years, such a crater would have been filled in by wind-blown sand, floods, or vegetation. It might be completely invisible on the surface, detectable only through ground-penetrating radar or a magnetic anomaly survey that reveals the strange, dense layer of fused material beneath the Earth. The final and most haunting evidence would be a mass gravesite. The skeletons would need to show a specific and bizarre pattern of damage. Bones flash burned on one side, indicating the direction of the thermal pulse. Or even more telling, skeletons showing no external trauma, but with DNA damage consistent with acute radiation exposure. Analyzing ancient bone for radiation damage is notoriously difficult, as DNA degrades over time, but advanced techniques might one day detect the unique patterns of mutation caused by intense ionizing radiation. Finding all three together, a radioactive layer, a fractionated glass crater, and a radiogenic mass grave, would be the trifecta. It would be evidence that could not be explained by any known natural phenomenon, not by volcanoes, not by lightning, and not by comet strikes. The greatest challenge, however, is time itself. The Earth is a living archive, constantly rewriting its own history. Plate tectonics subducts continents, rivers change their courses, and deserts bury entire cities under mountains of sand. The evidence for such an event, if it happened 10 or 12,000 years ago, might lie at the bottom of an ocean or be ground into dust by the slow, inexorable march of glaciers. We are left searching for ghosts in the geological record, for whispers of an impossible past that refuses to be completely silenced. This lost knowledge poses a profound moral question for our own time. We stand at a similar precipice, wielding technologies of immense power, whose long-term consequences we cannot fully predict. The central dilemma is this: does the relentless pursuit of knowledge inevitably lead to our own destruction? Or is the deliberate forgetting of certain discoveries the only path to survival? If an ancient society truly grasped the atom's secret, their inability to manage that power, or their conscious choice to abandon it, echoes as a warning across the millennia. It suggests that advancement is not a one-way street. A civilization can peak, recognize a terminal threat in its own creations, and then deliberately walk itself back from the brink, allowing the dangerous knowledge to fade into myth. This is not a failure of intellect, but perhaps a triumph of wisdom. The real measure of an advanced civilization may not be what it can build, but what it chooses, for the sake of its own future, not to build. We face this same choice every day. Our innovations in artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, and of course, nuclear arsenals, all carry this dual edge. They promise to cure diseases and connect the world, but they also hold the potential for chaos and irreversible harm. The story of Sekhmet forces us to ask, Are we any wiser than those who came before us? Do we have the collective maturity to handle the forces we are unlocking, or are we simply repeating an ancient cycle, building a tower of knowledge that will one day collapse under its own weight? The silence of the past is not empty. It is filled with the ghost of a question, one that we are now compelled to answer for ourselves. Let us walk back through the ancient words, but this time, with the shadow of a modern cataclysm falling across them. The text begins with humanity plotting rebellion against the high god Ra. In the traditional view, this is a spiritual allegory for chaos threatening order. But through our new lens, this rebellion could symbolize something else entirely: a dangerous shift in knowledge or a catastrophic misuse of a power that was never meant to be touched. It is the moment before the button is pressed, the instant of irreversible error. Ra's response is not a flood or an earthquake. He summons his daughter, the Eye, and commands her to descend. She is not a monster from the abyss, but a power sent from above. This initial dispatch mirrors the launch of a projectile or the triggering of a device from a command center, an action initiated from a place of authority. Then comes the transformation. The goddess changes into Sekhmet, the powerful one. This is not a simple change of costume. It is an escalation, a shift in the nature of the event itself. The initial command signal transforms into the unleashed warhead, the inert mechanism becoming the active, destructive force. Her name itself, Sekhmet, meaning the powerful one, is a perfect descriptor for the raw, impersonal force of a nuclear detonation. Now, observe the specific sequence of her attack. The text says she waded into the desert and began her slaughter. But note the method. It is a fire that consumes, a scorching breath like a furnace. This is the precise, two-stage effect of a nuclear blast. The first effect is the thermal pulse, a wave of light and heat so intense it ignites everything flammable across a vast area. This is Sekhmet's fire. It is followed instantly by the blast wave, a supersonic front of superheated, compressed air that scours the landscape and demolishes all structures. This is her scorching breath, the furnace wind that flattens everything in its path. The text is describing effects in their correct, scientific order. Then we encounter the most cryptic and debated line. The land is flooded with a red liquid up to the height of a man's ankles. Symbolically, this is the lifeblood of the land. Literally, through our new lens, this could be a stark description of nuclear fallout. After a detonation, a cloud of vaporized material and dust rises, then settles back to Earth, often in a reddish or brownish hue due to oxidized iron and other minerals. This settling dust could easily be described as a shallow, staining flood. It is not a deep river, but a pervasive coating, a poison that covers the ground. The story's climax is the god's intervention with the red beer. Ra orders his priests to dye 7,000 jars of beer red and pour it across the fields. Sekhmet sees it, drinks, and falls into a stupor. Her rampage ended. This seems like pure fantasy until you consider it as an allegory for decontamination. After a radiological event, the primary response is to flush the area with water or other liquids to neutralize and wash away radioactive particles. The red beer, poured in a massive, deliberate operation, could represent a desperate, large-scale attempt to cleanse the poisoned land. The intoxicating effect is key. She is not killed, but pacified. Radiation is not destroyed, it is mitigated, its harmful effects reduced over time. The destructive force is put to sleep. Finally, the aftermath is a world rendered barren and silent. This is not a temporary drought. It is a description of long-term ecological collapse, a nuclear winter where the soil is poisoned and the food chain is broken. The myth captures a permanent desolation, a scar on the world that breaks the natural cycle of death and rebirth. Every element, from the initial command to the final, sterile silence, fits not as a collection of random symbols, but as a coherent, step-by-step account of a cataclysm. The ancient scribes did not have the words for fission or radiation. They had only the language of gods and goddesses, of fire and curses, to describe a horror that, until very recently, we believed was ours alone to invent. The evidence for an ancient nuclear event remains locked in a perpetual debate, a courtroom where the witnesses are myths and the exhibits are pieces of fused glass. On one side, the parallels are too unnerving to ignore. The step-by-step sequence of the Sekhmet story mirrors the precise effects of a nuclear detonation with an almost clinical accuracy. The blinding flash, the thermal firestorm, the scouring blast wave, the strange red fallout, and the lingering invisible sickness that kills weeks later. This is not the typical language of a simple drought allegory. It reads like a trauma response, a desperate attempt to catalog the uncatalogable. The physical evidence, from the vitrified desert stone to the anomalous radiation hotspots and the eerie echoes from Mohenjo-Daro, provides a tangible, if controversial, foundation for these stories. These are not just words on a wall, they are potential scars on the planet itself. The most powerful argument is the human one. The testimonies from Hiroshima and Nagasaki prove exactly how a human civilization, without the scientific vocabulary, would describe a nuclear horror, using terms of divine suns and demonic winds. The ancient Egyptians, facing a similar cataclysm, would have done the same, encoding the truth within their only available framework, the drama of gods and goddesses. Yet the case against the theory is built on the solid ground of established science and academic consensus. The traditional interpretation of the Sekhmet myth is elegant and internally consistent, a sophisticated allegory about Mot and the pharaoh's divine right to wield power. To reduce it to a primitive description of a bomb is to strip it of its profound theological and philosophical meaning. Scientifically, every piece of anomalous physical evidence has a more probable, natural explanation. The desert glass can be formed by massive lightning strikes or cosmic airbursts like the Tunguska event. The radiation spikes could be from modern contamination or concentrated natural deposits. The Baghdad battery was almost certainly not a battery in the way we think of it, but a religious or medical curiosity. The greatest hurdle remains the sheer impossibility of the ancient Egyptians possessing the foundational knowledge for nuclear physics. They were master engineers and astronomers, but the leap from copper chisels to enriching uranium is an ocean of understanding they simply did not possess. The theory requires a suspension of disbelief that much of the scientific community finds untenable. So where does this leave us, in the end? We are left with a mystery that may never be definitively solved. There is no smoking gun, no ancient stratum of plutonium-239, no unequivocal crater. The verdict, then, is not guilty for lack of proof, yet the case is never truly closed. The haunting resonance between an ancient text and a modern nightmare is too powerful to dismiss entirely. Perhaps the truth is not a binary choice, but something in the shifting sands between. The cataclysm may not have been a man-made bomb, but a natural cosmic or geological event that mimicked one so perfectly that the difference was meaningless to those who lived through it. The story of Sekhmet endures not because it provides answers, but because it asks a timeless question. It forces us to look at our own civilization, with its own world-altering power, and wonder if we are the first to stand at this precipice, or merely the latest in a long, cyclical line, listening for a warning on the desert wind that we have not yet learned to fully understand. We began with words carved beside a boy king's sarcophagus, a story of a fiery goddess and a land stained red. That single cryptic text has led us across a landscape of impossible glass, whispered radiation, and silent cities filled with unburied bones. It is a journey that stretches from the deepest wells of mythology to the cutting edge of modern physics, a puzzle that refuses to be solved. The evidence remains a collection of tantalizing fragments, a case built on eerie parallels and unsettling anomalies rather than a single, undeniable truth. We are left standing between two worlds, one where the story is a profound allegory of divine order, and another where it is the ghost of a cataclysm, a warning from a forgotten age. This mystery forces us to confront the sheer fragility of history itself. Our entire understanding of the past is built upon what has survived, the tiny fraction of evidence that escaped the relentless erosion of time, the decay of papyrus, and the shifting sands. What monumental truths have been lost simply because no one was there to write them down, or because the writing itself turned to dust? The silence of the millennia is not empty. It is a canvas upon which we project our greatest questions and our deepest fears. Perhaps the real secret buried in the desert is not a specific technology, but a humbling realization that our civilization may not be the first to grasp the building blocks of the universe, only to be undone by them. The sands still hold their secrets close. What do you believe lies beneath them? The floor is yours. Share your thoughts, your own theories, and the mysteries that captivate you in the comments below. The conversation is just beginning.